They said his body was a weapon no woman could survive. 19 had tried. 19 had run screaming. And tonight one would either break the curse or die trying. Asher Thorne stood 6 feet 8 inches of bronze skin and battle-forged dominance, an alpha king whose presence alone could force grown men to their knees. His dark hair fell in waves when wet, his eyes shifted between amber and obsidian depending on his mood, and those massive, scarred hands could crush stone or cradle something fragile with devastating gentleness. Yet beneath the crown and the conquests lived a bitter secret that had hollowed him from the inside out. He was a king rejected by every highborn woman from the Crimson Gorge to the moonlit shores. 19 women in 4 years. 19 broken promises. Some gasped in horror the moment they saw him fully unclothed. Others wept with fear, calling him unnatural, before fleeing his chambers. Bride number 7 fainted and refused to wake in his presence. Number 12 compared him to a breeding animal with disgust dripping from every word. Several laughed cruelly, as if his anatomy were nature's cruelest joke. They whispered his name in back corridors and shadowed alcoves, the king cursed by excess. Not cursed by cruelty or madness, but by a physical nature so overwhelming, so impossibly proportioned that no woman had ever been brave enough to claim him. A conqueror who could seize kingdoms, but never a heart. A warrior destined to stand alone. But deep in the hidden waterfall sanctuary where he went to escape judging eyes, the silence of his isolation was about to shatter. Before we go any further, let me ask you something important. If the world told you that you were too much, too different, too broken, too impossible to ever be loved, would you still believe you deserve it? If Asher and Ivy's story is already stirring something inside you, I'd be honored to have you join me on this journey. I'm building something truly special here on Tina's Romance Room, and your support means everything. Please hit that subscribe button, drop a like, and leave a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. It helps this channel grow more than you know, and it reminds me that I'm not telling these stories alone. Now, let's return to the moment everything changed. The rain had turned the forest surrounding the sacred waterfall into a treacherous maze of slick stone and tangled roots. Through the cascading water, a flicker of white fabric cut through the darkness, torn, desperate, running for her life. Ivy Morrow, a delicate omega with flowing auburn hair and emerald eyes wide with terror, crashed through the foliage into Asher's secret sanctuary. Her white cotton dress was torn and soaked, clinging to her petite 5 feet 3 inches frame as she stumbled into the crystalline pool. Blood stained her bare feet, and her breath came in ragged, desperate gasps. Behind her, voices echoed through the forest, armed slavers closing in, men who saw her as nothing more than property to be bought, sold, and broken. She never saw him standing there in the shadows, water cascading over his massive shoulders, watching this terrified woman collapse into a sanctuary like a fallen angel. And Asher Thorne, the king cursed by excess, would make a choice in the next 10 seconds that would either save them both or destroy everything. Ivy woke to softness. It was so foreign, so unexpected that for a moment she thought she'd died in the forest, and this was whatever came after. The bed beneath her was a cloud of silk and down, nothing like the hard wooden planks of the holding cells or the cold ground where she'd collapsed too many nights to count. Golden morning light filtered through floor-to-ceiling windows, and beyond them, she gasped, a waterfall cascaded in an endless sheet of crystalline water, the sound a constant lullaby that vibrated through her bones. The chamber was vast enough to swallow her family's entire cottage 3 times over. Carved stone columns supported a vaulted ceiling painted with constellations she didn't recognize. Everything spoke of power, permanence, protection. Then she saw him. Asher sat across the room in a chair that looked absurdly small beneath his 6 feet 8 inches frame. He'd positioned himself by the door, hands folded carefully in his lap, visible and unthreatening. His massive shoulders were hunched forward as if he were trying to make himself smaller, less imposing. He wore simple clothing now, a loose linen shirt and dark trousers, and his dark hair was still damp from the waterfall. "You're safe," he said, his voice gentle despite its depth, like distant thunder that wouldn't harm you. I give you my word. No one enters these rooms without my permission. Ivy pushed herself upright, and pain immediately shot through her feet, sharp, vicious reminders of her desperate flight through the forest. The movement drew his attention to her injuries, and something shifted in his expression. Not pity, recognition. As if he understood what it meant to hurt. May I? He gestured toward her feet, his massive hands moving with careful deliberation. She nodded, unable to find her voice. Words felt dangerous, as if speaking might shatter whatever fragile safety she'd stumbled into. Asher crossed the room and knelt before the bed. The sight was absurd, a king on his knees for a runaway Omega who owned nothing but the torn dress on her back. He reached for a crystal basin filled with water that caught the light like liquid diamonds, then carefully lifted her foot. His hands were enormous, scarred from what must have been 100 battles, calloused and rough. Yet they moved with impossible gentleness as he cleaned the cuts, each touch featherlight despite the raw strength she could feel barely restrained beneath his skin. Ivy's breath caught when she noticed his knuckles, a maze of old wounds, some barely healed, white scar tissue layered over older injuries. Who hurt you? The question escaped before she could stop it. His hands stilled against her foot. A bitter laugh rumbled from his chest, devoid of any real humor. Everyone eventually, he said quietly. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken pain that felt oddly familiar. Two people who'd been broken by the world in different ways. My family sold me to pay gambling debts, Ivy heard herself say, the words tumbling out like a confession. I was 14. They told me it was temporary, that they'd buy me back once father's fortunes turned. She laughed, and it sounded as hollow as his had. They never came. Asher's jaw clenched, but he didn't interrupt, just kept cleaning her wounds with those devastatingly gentle hands. I was passed through 3 slave houses in 4 years, she continued, surprised by how steady her voice remained. They marked me as defective merchandise because I fought back. Because I refused to break the way they wanted me to. She met his dark eyes, finding them fixed on her with an intensity that should have frightened her, but somehow didn't. The last house decided I was more trouble than I was worth. They were going to. Her voice finally cracked. So I ran. You're brave, he said simply, as if it were an undeniable fact rather than an opinion. I'm terrified, she corrected. Brave people usually are. They just run toward things anyway. As he finished tending her feet and moved to her wrists, rope burns from restraints she'd slipped 3 days ago. Ivy studied his face. The strong jawline with its faint scar, the dark eyes that held depths she couldn't read, the way he kept his gaze averted as if worried his attention might be unwelcome. You're him, aren't you? She whispered. The king everyone whispers about. His hands stilled again. What do they say? That you're different. That no woman has ever. She trailed off, uncertain how to finish without causing offense. That no woman has ever been able to stay, he finished for her, his voice flat. It's true. 19 have tried. All of them fled. Why? He finally looked up, and the vulnerability in his eyes nearly broke her. Because I'm too much. In every way that matters. Later, when exhaustion began claiming her again despite the hours she'd apparently already slept, Asher insisted she rest. He built a careful barrier of pillows down the center of his massive bed, a wall between them that somehow felt more protective than divisive. Then he lay on top of the covers, still fully clothed in his shirt and trousers, positioning himself as far from her as the bed allowed, his large frame pressed against the very edge. You don't have to, Ivy began. I do, he interrupted gently. Sleep. You're safe here. She woke once in the deepest part of night. The waterfall song had become a familiar rhythm, and in its sound, she could hear Asher's breathing, slow, measured, controlled. He'd curled himself into the smallest space possible at the bed's edge, his massive frame folded uncomfortably, one arm dangling off the side, as if even in sleep he was trying to take up less space. This powerful man who could crush armies had made himself small for her comfort. Tears slipped down Ivy's cheeks, not from fear or pain, but from recognition. She'd spent her life being told she was worthless, too broken to deserve kindness. And here was a king who'd clearly spent his life being told he was too much, too overwhelming to deserve love. "Thank you," she whispered into the darkness. Morning brought raised voices from beyond the chamber doors. Heavy footsteps. The sound of multiple people demanding entry. Asher's eyes opened instantly, meeting Ivy's across the pillow barrier. For the first time since she'd met him, she saw something new in his expression. Determination. The royal council had arrived, and they were demanding answers about the unclaimed Omega in their king's private chambers. The council chambers felt like a trap closing. 12 men in formal robes surrounded a long table of polished obsidian, their faces ranging from curious to openly hostile. Ivy sat in a chair that felt too large, too exposed, acutely aware of her borrowed dress and the bandages visible at her wrists. Lord Darius Kane stood at the head of the table, Asher's half-brother, though they shared almost nothing in appearance. Where Asher was bronze and battle-scarred, Darius was pale and polished, his dark hair slicked back, his smile sharp as a blade. Behind him stood Lady Seraphina, draped in emerald silk, her beauty as cold and perfect as winter ice. "This is highly irregular, Your Majesty," Darius began, his voice carrying false concern. "An unclaimed Omega in your private chambers raises questions of propriety." "Lady Ivy sought sanctuary," Asher replied, his voice dangerously calm. "Which I granted under the ancient laws of—" "We've received documentation," Darius interrupted, sliding a sealed parchment across the table. "From the Viridian Trading Company. This Omega is contracted property. She must be returned immediately." The words hit Ivy like a physical blow. Contracted property. As if she were livestock that had wandered from its pen. "The law clearly states," Asher began again. "You want to talk about what's legal?" Ivy's voice cut through the chamber before she realized she'd stood, before she'd given herself permission to speak. Every eye turned to her, shock rippling through the council members. Omegas didn't interrupt. They certainly didn't challenge lords. But Ivy was done being silent. "Let's talk about the slave markets operating in your territories, Lord Darius," she continued, her voice ringing clear despite her trembling hands. "The auction houses in the merchant quarter, where children are sold to the highest bidder. Let's talk about nobles who profit from misery while discussing legality in marble chambers." Darius's face darkened. "You speak above your station." "I have no station," Ivy shot back. "That's your entire system, isn't it? Strip people of everything so they can't fight back." She turned to Asher, seeing the shock in his dark eyes that someone would defend him publicly, that someone would risk herself for him. "This man could have turned me away last night. The hunters were at his gates. He could have handed me over and avoided all of this." "Perhaps he should have," Seraphina interjected, her voice dripping venom. "We all know why he keeps you close. Desperate men make desperate choices." The chamber fell silent. Ivy watched Asher's jaw clench, saw the way his massive hands curled into fists against the table, felt the alpha energy beginning to radiate from him like heat from forged steel. "This man," Ivy continued, her voice dropping to something fierce and protective, "gave me safety when I had none. Kindness when I'd forgotten what it felt like. Respect, something none of you have offered anyone who isn't useful to you." She looked directly at Seraphina. "And whatever judgment you're passing, whatever cruelty you're disguising as concern, says far more about you than it does about him." Asher rose, and the sheer presence of him silenced every whisper, every breath. "Lady Ivy is under my personal protection as my ward," he declared, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "Anyone who touches her answers to me." The words hung in the air like a thrown gauntlet. In 5 years, the king had claimed no one, protected no one. This declaration shifted everything. Darius's smile was thin and poisonous. "Of course, Your Majesty. We only seek to uphold the law." "Then uphold it," Asher replied coldly. "Starting with investigating those auction houses," Lady Ivy mentioned. "I'll expect your report by week's end." The council dispersed like shadows fleeing light, their whispers following them into the corridors. Evening found Ivy in the palace's moonlit gardens, hidden behind high walls where jasmine bloomed white and fragrant. She sat on a stone bench, arms wrapped around herself, replaying the confrontation until her head ached. "They're right, you know." Asher's voice came from the shadows, rough with something she couldn't name. He stepped into the moonlight, and she saw the vulnerability carved into his features. "I am too much. I've seen the fear in every woman's eyes when they discover the truth." "What truth?" Ivy asked quietly. "That I'm impossibly proportioned. That nature was excessive when it made me." The words came out laden with shame. 19 women have seen me fully. Bride number 7 screamed and called me a freak. Number 12 compared me to a breeding animal. 15 lasted 30 seconds before fleeing in tears. His voice cracked. "They made me feel like a monster before I ever acted like one." Ivy stood and crossed to him. Before he could retreat, before he could make himself smaller as she'd seen him do a dozen times, she took his massive hand in both of hers. His skin was warm, rough with calluses, trembling slightly against her fingers. She pressed his palm flat against her chest, directly over her heart. "Do you feel that?" she whispered. His eyes widened, his breath catching as her heartbeat pounded steady and strong against his hand. "It's not afraid," Ivy continued, holding his gaze in the moonlight. "It's not racing in terror. It's not preparing to run." She stepped closer, until the heat of his body radiated against her skin. "You saved me. You knelt to clean my wounds. You made yourself small so I could feel safe." Her voice turned fierce. "The only monsters I see are the ones who convinced you that being different means being wrong." Asher's hand trembled violently under hers, this massive hand that could crush stone, gentle against her heartbeat. "I could never hurt you," he breathed, and it sounded like a vow. "I know," she whispered back. "That's the difference between you and them. They see size. I see restraint. They see power. I see control." She placed her free hand over his heart, feeling it thunder beneath her palm like war drums. "They see a weapon. I see a man who's forgotten. He deserves to be held." Something crumbled in his expression. For a long moment, they stood there in the jasmine-scented darkness, two broken people recognizing each other's scars. And for the first time in years, Asher allowed himself the dangerous luxury of hope. Dawn painted the training courtyard in shades of amber and rose. Ivy stood at the colonnade's edge, wrapped in a borrowed shawl, watching Asher move through combat forms with a sword that looked almost delicate in his massive hands. Each strike was controlled precision. Each pivot demonstrated lethal grace that shouldn't have been possible for a man his size. Sweat gleamed on his bronze skin as he flowed from one movement to the next, his body a weapon honed by years of discipline. But what captured Ivy's attention wasn't the violence of the movements, it was the restraint visible in every breath, every measured strike. He was holding back. Even alone, even training against invisible opponents, he was careful not to unleash his full strength. When he finally caught her watching, his hand immediately reached for the discarded shirt draped over a bench. Self-consciousness flickered across his features like a shadow. "Don't," Ivy said, the word emerging stronger than she intended. He froze, shirt halfway to his shoulders. "You're beautiful," she finished quietly. His laugh was disbelieving, almost bitter. But when he met her eyes and saw no fear there, no disgust, just honest admiration, the laugh transformed into wonder. Fragile, tentative hope that looked painful on his scarred face. Later, in his private study where morning light spilled through tall windows, Asher finally told her about the 19. They sat by the fire, and he recounted each rejection like confessing sins he hadn't committed. "Bride number 4 ran screaming from my chambers," he began, his voice hollow. "She told the entire court I was cursed by demons." Ivy's hands clenched in her lap, fury building with each word. "Number 7 called me a freak when she saw." He gestured vaguely at himself. "She said nature had made a mistake." Number 9 fainted. Her family physician said the shock nearly killed her. He laughed, but the sound held no humor. Number 12 compared me to a breeding animal. Said I was built for violence, not love. Stop, Ivy whispered, but he didn't hear her. 15 lasted 30 seconds before fleeing in tears. 18 laughed, actually laughed, like my body was some cosmic joke. His voice finally cracked. I stopped undressing after the 8th. Just told them the truth before we got that far. Saved everyone time and humiliation. They made me feel like a monster before I ever acted like one, he said, staring into the flames. The silence stretched between them, filled only with the crackling fire and Ivy's rapidly accelerating heartbeat. They didn't deserve you, she said finally, her voice sharp with rage. Asher looked up, surprised by her tone. They were too small-minded to recognize that different doesn't mean wrong, Ivy continued, rising from her chair. They were cowards who couldn't see past their own narrow expectations of what a man should be. Ivy.
No.
She crossed to where he sat, her bare feet silent on the stone floor. You've spent years letting their fear define you. Years believing their rejection meant you were unworthy. She knelt before him, forcing him to meet her eyes. But they're the ones who failed, not you. The air between them shifted, charged with something electric that made her skin hum. Asher's dark eyes widened, vulnerability and desire warring across his features. Ivy reached up, cupping his scarred jaw with both hands. His skin was warm, rough with morning stubble, and she felt him tremble at her touch. You've been trying so hard not to be loved that you've forgotten you deserve it, she whispered. The space between them evaporated. She didn't know who moved first, only that suddenly his hands were cupping her face with impossible gentleness, and her fingers were tangled in his dark hair. The kiss was desperate and tender, a collision of hope and fear, and something deeper than either of them had words for. His lips were soft against hers despite the hardness of everything else about him. He kissed her like she was precious, like she might disappear if he pressed too hard, and the contrast between his massive frame and his careful touch made something in Ivy's chest crack open. When they finally broke apart, he pressed his forehead to hers, breathing hard. His voice cracked. I've never kissed anyone who stayed long enough. Ivy pulled him closer, her hands framing his face. I'm staying, she promised against his lips. I'm not going anywhere. Outside the study door, Royal Advisor Marcus Fletcher backed away slowly, his arms full of documents he'd been bringing for the king's signature. His eyes were wide, his expression carefully blank. Saw nothing, he muttered to himself, nearly tripping over his own feet in his haste to retreat. Absolutely nothing. The king's private affairs are entirely private. But in the shadows of the East Wing, far from the morning light and tentative hope, Darius Kane stood at a tall window watching the courtyard below. His jaw was clenched, fury radiating from every line of his body. Beside him, Lady Seraphina smiled like a blade catching light. She's made him weak, Darius said, his voice cold and sharp. Good, Seraphina replied, her emerald dress rustling as she moved closer. Weak kings are easy to destroy. The coronation gala is in 3 weeks, Darius continued, his reflection in the glass showing calculation in his eyes. Plenty of time to arrange complications. Seraphina's smile widened. I know someone who specializes in complications. Someone who can provide exactly what we need. They stood together in the shadows, conspiracy taking shape between them like poison brewing in darkness. Neither noticed the small serving girl who'd been dusting the far corner, her eyes wide with fear as she slipped silently from the room. In Asher's study, Ivy and the king who'd forgotten how to hope were learning that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is let yourself be seen completely. They had no idea that in the shadows, enemies were already sharpening their knives. The messenger arrived at dawn with urgent news. Border disputes in the northern settlements, villages threatened, Asher's presence required immediately. Ivy found him in the war room already armored, studying maps with his generals, and the sight of him dressed for potential combat made her chest tighten. He looked up when she entered, and the professional mask cracked. I don't want to leave you, he said simply. You have to, Ivy replied, crossing to him and placing her hand over his breastplate where his heart thundered beneath the steel. You're their king before you're mine. I'm yours first, he said fiercely, covering her hand with his massive one. Always yours first. In the pre-dawn courtyard, his warhorse stamped impatiently, its breath misting in the cold air. Asher pulled Ivy close one last time, breathing in the scent of her hair like he was memorizing it. Wait for me, he murmured. Then he slid a ring onto her finger, an ancient band of twisted silver and moonstone that caught the first rays of sunlight. My mother's ring. 3 days, and I'll be back. Ivy watched him mount, watched the generals fall into formation around him. She stood at the gates long after they'd disappeared, until he was nothing but a shadow against the rising sun, until even that shadow was gone. 2 days felt like 2 years. Ivy wandered the palace, trying to occupy herself, trying not to count the hours until his return. She'd been searching for the restricted archives. Marcus had mentioned historical records about Omega rites that might help their cause, when she found herself lost in the palace's abandoned west wing. The corridors here twisted like a maze, tapestries covering walls that hadn't seen sunlight in decades. Dust motes danced in shafts of light from cracked windows. Everything felt forgotten, left to decay. That's when she heard the voices. The coronation gala is in 2 days. Darius's smooth tone echoed from somewhere below, distorted but unmistakable. The sound came through a ventilation grate near the floor, carrying up from what must be the old wine cellars. Ivy froze, her heart beginning to hammer. And you're certain this compound will work? That was Seraphina's voice, cold and calculating. It triggers complete loss of control, Darius replied. His alpha instincts will override everything: reason, restraint, recognition. Combined with his nature, his size, the violence will be catastrophic. Seraphina's laugh was like ice cracking. When they find her body torn apart, even his most loyal supporters will demand execution. No one will question what he is anymore. And I, dear brother, will restore order by taking the crown, Darius finished. The beta line was always stronger anyway, more stable. Ivy's hand flew to her mouth, smothering a gasp. Her heart stopped, then started again with sickening force. To the fall of the cursed king, Seraphina said, and Ivy heard the clink of glasses. She backed away slowly, terror making her clumsy. Her shoulder hit a wall panel, and the sound echoed in the empty corridor like a gunshot.
She ran.
Marcus Fletcher believed her immediately when she burst into his office, wild-eyed and breathless. The old advisor had never trusted Darius, but his face went gray as she recounted what she'd heard. We need to send word to the king, Ivy said desperately.
Now.
They tried. Every courier Ivy approached suddenly had urgent business elsewhere. The messenger birds in the royal aviary were inexplicably unavailable for official use. Even Marcus's most trusted riders found their horses mysteriously lame or their saddles sabotaged. They've bought them off, Marcus said grimly, slamming his fist on his desk. Every rider, every carrier bird, every messenger in the palace. He looked at Ivy with something like despair. The coronation gala is tomorrow night. Asher returns at dusk. The timeline crashed over Ivy like ice water. Tomorrow. The poisoned drink, the triggered rage, her death, Asher's execution. All of it orchestrated to perfection. There has to be a way, she whispered, looking down at the moonstone ring on her finger. Marcus was silent for a long moment. The northern camp is a day's hard ride, he finally said. Through the Crimson Gorge. Ivy knew the name. Everyone did. The Crimson Gorge had killed experienced travelers, hardened soldiers, people far more prepared than a runaway Omega with barely healed feet. It's suicide, Marcus continued. The Serpent's Pass, the underground river, the gorge cats that hunt at night. It's my only option, Ivy interrupted, her voice steady despite the terror coursing through her veins. You'll never make it in time. And even if you did, I have to try, she said, looking at the ring that bound her to a man who'd taught her what it meant to be chosen. A man who'd knelt to clean her wounds, who'd made himself small so she could feel safe, who'd finally learned to hope because she'd shown him how. Marcus studied her face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. I'll get you supplies. traveling clothes, provisions. But you'll need to leave at midnight if you want any chance of reaching him before dawn. That evening, Ivy stood at the window of Asher's chambers, watching the sun set over the kingdom he protected. The Crimson Gorge stretched somewhere beyond the horizon, waiting.
Deadly.
Unforgiving. She twisted the moonstone ring on her finger, feeling its weight. 3 days, he'd said. Wait for me. But waiting meant watching him die. Meant letting their enemies win. Meant giving up on the first person who'd ever seen her as something more than property. I'm coming, Ivy whispered to the darkness. Wait for me. Midnight found Ivy slipping through the servants' gate in borrowed traveling clothes that hung loose on her frame. Her feet, barely healed from her first escape, protested with every step, but she ignored the pain. Marcus had given her what he could, a water skin, dried meat, a small knife, and wished her luck with eyes that said he didn't expect to see her again. The Crimson Gorge stretched before her like an open wound carved into the earth, red rock formations jutting skyward like jagged teeth against the starlit sky. The air smelled of dust and something ancient, something that had witnessed countless deaths. Ivy thought of Asher's hands, impossibly gentle despite their size, the way they'd trembled against her heartbeat in the moonlit garden. She stepped into the darkness. The Serpent's Pass earned its name within the first hour. A narrow ledge carved into the cliff face centuries ago, it snaked along sheer drops that disappeared into blackness below. The stone crumbled with age, each step a gamble against gravity. The first time the path gave way, Ivy's scream died in her throat as she plummeted. Her hands shot out instinctively, catching a jutting rock that tore her palms open. She hung there, feet dangling over nothing, blood making everything slippery. Come back to me, Asher had said, and she hauled herself up handhold by agonizing handhold. The second collapse happened without warning. One moment she was walking, the next she was falling, her fingers scrabbling against ancient stone until they found purchase on a root system that shouldn't have existed at this altitude. Blood painted the rocks crimson as she pulled herself back onto the ledge, gasping. She reached the underground river as false dawn painted the eastern sky gray. The entrance gaped like a mouth in the gorge wall, water rushing through with relentless force. There was no other path forward. Ivy stripped to her undergarments with shaking hands, knowing the heavy traveling clothes would drag her under. The water was so cold it stole her breath the moment she plunged in, shock lancing through every nerve. The current seized her immediately, dragging her through submerged passages where the ceiling pressed close enough to scrape her back. Her lungs screamed for air as the river pulled her deeper into darkness. Panic clawed at her mind. She was going to drown in the belly of the earth, and Asher would never know she'd tried. Then light, faint, distant, and Ivy clawed toward it with strength born of desperation. She broke the surface gasping, her limbs numb, hypothermia creeping through her blood like poison. The riverbank was sharp rocks and sparse vegetation. Ivy dragged herself onto it, shaking so violently her teeth chattered loud enough to echo. She needed to move, needed to keep her blood flowing, but her body felt like it belonged to someone else. That's when she heard them, the hunting calls of gorge cats, their cries echoing off canyon walls. They'd scented her blood, and they were closing in. Terror overrode exhaustion. Ivy ran, her bare feet shredding on the sharp rocks, leaving a trail any predator could follow. The cliff face loomed ahead, sheer, impossible, her only chance. She began climbing without thinking, her bleeding hands finding cracks and ledges, her body moving on pure instinct. Below, shadows moved with predatory grace, golden eyes reflecting the growing dawn light. Her hands slipped twice. Her muscles screamed in protest. But she kept climbing, pulling herself up handhold by bleeding handhold, because falling meant death and death meant Asher would walk into that coronation gala with no one to warn him. At the top, Ivy collapsed, her body shaking so violently she couldn't stand. Through blurred vision, she saw it, the northern road below, and a dust cloud approaching from the north. Riders. It had to be Asher's party returning. Ivy forced herself to her feet, swaying dangerously. Every step left crimson footprints on pale stone, but she ran anyway, stumbling down the slope toward the road. Asher saw her first. His roar of anguish echoed through the gorge, a sound of pure animal terror that made his general's horses shy in fear. He was off his mount before it stopped moving, catching her as her legs finally gave out. "Ivy, what happened? Who did this?" "I'll kill them, I'll—" "Poison," she gasped, each word agony. "The wine at the coronation toast. Darius and Seraphina. They'll trigger alpha rage. They'll make you lose control, kill me, blame you." Her vision was blurring, the world tilting sideways. She felt herself slipping away, felt the darkness reaching for her. "No, no, stay with me." Asher's voice cracked, desperate and broken. "Ivy, stay. Always," she whispered, and then there was only darkness. Asher's face transformed. The fear bled away, replaced by something colder, sharper, controlled fury that made his general step back instinctively. The alpha energy radiating from him should have been destructive, but it was leashed tight, weaponized precision rather than mindless rage. "Double time to the palace," he commanded, his voice like winter itself. "No stops. No mercy for anyone who slows us down." He mounted his warhorse one-handed, cradling Ivy's broken body against his chest like she was made of spun glass. As they rode, he pressed his lips to her forehead and whispered promises to her unconscious form. Promises about conspirators who would learn the difference between a beast and a king. About a reckoning that would shake the palace to its foundations. About a love that would survive anything, betrayal, poison, even death itself. "You ran through the Crimson Gorge for me," he murmured, his voice breaking. "Now watch me burn down anyone who dared threaten us." The hunting party thundered toward the palace, carrying a king who'd finally learned that the greatest power wasn't in his strength. It was in being loved enough that someone would bleed themselves broken just to save him. The royal physician worked in grim silence, her weathered hands moving with practiced efficiency over wounds that spoke of impossible determination. Ivy's feet were shredded, her palms torn to the bone, her body trembling with exhaustion and the lingering effects of hypothermia. Asher sat beside the bed, his massive frame rigid as carved stone, watching every breath she took as if afraid it might be her last. His face was a mask of terror barely contained, the alpha energy radiating from him making even the physician's hands shake slightly as she worked. When Ivy's eyes finally fluttered open, he released a sound between a prayer and a sob, his hand shooting out to cup her face with devastating gentleness. "The toast at the coronation," Ivy rasped immediately, her voice raw. "I know," Asher interrupted, his thumb brushing her cheekbone. "You crossed the Crimson Gorge for me. You nearly died for me. You would have done the same," she whispered, her emerald eyes holding his. His voice broke completely. "No one has ever." Ivy silenced him with a kiss, her bandaged hand reaching up to pull him closer despite the physician's disapproving sound. When they broke apart, Asher pressed his forehead to hers, breathing her in like she was air itself. Within the hour, his war council assembled in the private chambers. Marcus Fletcher arrived first, relief flooding his features when he saw Ivy conscious. Commander Reese followed, a battle-scarred veteran who'd served Asher since his coronation, along with half a dozen guards whose loyalty had been tested in blood. "We let them think the plan proceeds," Asher said, his strategic mind already 3 steps ahead despite the emotion still raw in his eyes. "The wine gets switched with harmless liquid. We position witnesses throughout the hall, people they can't bribe or intimidate." "The city merchants," Marcus suggested. "Common citizens. They have no reason to protect Darius." "We could just arrest them now," Commander Reese offered. "Lock them in the dungeons until they confess." "Without proof, it's my word against a lord's," Asher replied. "The council would demand evidence." "No, we let them expose themselves publicly, where everyone can see exactly what they are." Ivy insisted on being present despite her injuries, propped up with pillows, her bandaged feet elevated. She watched Asher command his council with absolute authority, saw how his generals respected him not just for his strength, but for his restraint, his strategic thinking. "They wanted to prove you're a beast," she said quietly when the others were debating guard positions. Tomorrow, you prove you're a king. His amber eyes met hers across the room, and something passed between them that needed no words. As the council dispersed with their assignments, the sun setting beyond the windows, Asher waited until they were alone. Then he crossed to Ivy's bedside and slowly, deliberately knelt. This massive king choosing vulnerability, choosing to meet her at eye level. He took her bandaged hand in both of his, cradling it like something infinitely precious. I asked you once before, he began, his deep voice steady despite the emotion threatening to break through. In fear and desperation, stumbling over words because I didn't believe I deserved an answer. Ivy's breath caught. Let me ask you properly this time, Asher continued, his dark eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her heart stutter. Ivy Morrow, will you stand beside me? Will you be my queen and teach this kingdom that being different isn't the same as being wrong? His voice finally cracked. Will you show them that love isn't about fitting perfectly together? It's about choosing each other despite every reason not to? Tears streamed down Ivy's face. Yes, she whispered, then stronger. Always yes. The kiss was gentle, flavored with salt and promise, and the fierce determination of two people who'd both been told they were too much or not enough, finally finding home in each other. Tomorrow, Asher murmured against her lips. Together, Ivy corrected, her fingers tangling in his dark hair. Together, he agreed. That night, as Ivy slept wrapped in silk and safety, Asher stood at the windows overlooking his kingdom. The coronation gala preparations were underway below, servants hanging decorations, musicians rehearsing, the entire palace buzzing with anticipation for an event that would either bring justice or destruction. He twisted his mother's ring on Ivy's finger where it rested on the pillow beside her, this ancient band that had finally found its rightful owner. In the great hall, the ceremonial chalice was being polished to a mirror shine. Darius and Seraphina were somewhere in the palace, confident in their conspiracy, unaware that their perfect plan had already unraveled. Tomorrow, Asher would prove that his greatest weapon wasn't his strength or his size. It was his restraint, his discipline, his ability to control the alpha rage that his enemies assumed would be his downfall. Tomorrow, he would show them the difference between a beast and a king. But tonight, he watched Ivy sleep and made promises to the darkness. Promises about conspirators who would face justice. About a kingdom that would learn to celebrate difference rather than condemn it. About a love that had survived the Crimson Gorge and would survive whatever tomorrow brought. The feast was about to begin, and justice, long overdue, was finally coming home. The great hall blazed with 1,000 candles, their flames reflecting off polished marble and golden fixtures until the entire space seemed to burn with light. Every noble house had sent representatives, every council member sat in formal attire, and citizens who'd managed to secure entrance lined the back walls, their faces eager with anticipation. Ivy sat beside Asher at the high table, wearing a gown of midnight blue that Marcus had procured, silk that whispered against her bandaged feet hidden beneath the table. His mother's ring gleamed on her finger, visible to everyone who looked, a declaration before any words were spoken. 3 seats down, Darius and Seraphina wore celebration-like armor, smiles sharp as knives, eyes constantly drawn to the ceremonial chalice positioned before Asher's seat. The ancient silver vessel caught the candlelight, innocuous and deadly all at once. The feast proceeded with orchestrated precision. Courses came and went, each more elaborate than the last. Musicians played. Wine flowed freely. The entire hall buzzed with the energy of a kingdom celebrating its king's successful border campaign. Ivy's heart hammered against her ribs so hard she was certain everyone could hear it. Under the table, Asher's hand found hers, squeezing gently, a silent reminder that they were in this together. Finally, as tradition dictated, Darius rose. The hall quieted, all eyes turning to him as he lifted the ceremonial chalice with both hands. To my brother, the king, his voice carried across the hall, smooth and practiced, who once again proves that strength prevails. May his power serve this kingdom for years to come. He crossed to Asher, offering the chalice with a smile that didn't reach his cold eyes. The hall fell into absolute silence. Even the musicians stopped playing. Breath collectively held as Asher stood slowly, his 6 feet 8 inches frame commanding every eye, every thought. He took the chalice. Its weight settled in his massive hand with terrible familiarity. For one breathless moment, Asher raised it toward his lips. Then he hurled the entire contents directly into Darius's face. Gasps erupted throughout the hall like an explosion. Wine dripped from Darius's shocked features, staining his expensive silk tunic crimson. Ivy stood, her legs screaming protest, but her voice rang clear and unwavering. In her hand, she held a small vial of clear liquid that caught the candlelight like captured stars. 3 nights ago, I overheard Lord Darius Kane and Lady Seraphina plotting murder in the old wine cellars, she declared. Every word fell into the shocked silence, like stones into still water. This compound was meant for the king's drink. It triggers uncontrollable alpha rage. Combined with his nature, the violence would be catastrophic. She placed the vial on the table with deliberate care. When my body was found torn apart, Asher would be executed as the monster they'd always claimed he was. And Darius would take the throne to restore order. The royal physician stepped forward from where she'd been positioned among the witnesses, her weathered face grave. I have tested both this compound and the original chalice contents before it was switched, she announced. Lady Ivy speaks truth. This poison would have been fatal and framed His Majesty as an uncontrollable beast. Lies. Darius snarled, wine still dripping from his chin. He lunged forward, all pretense of civility abandoned. She's lying. He is a monster. Everyone knows it. He's too dangerous, too different, too. I have killed in war. Asher's voice cut through the hall like a blade, quiet but devastating in its control. Every muscle in his body was taut with fury, but his hands remained steady. His voice never rose. The alpha energy radiating from him should have shattered windows, but he held it leashed tight, weaponized precision rather than mindless rage. I have executed traitors, he continued, his dark eyes pinning Darius in place. But I have never once harmed someone who trusted me. That's not danger, brother. That's discipline. Something you clearly lack. Guards moved immediately, seizing Darius by both arms. Seraphina screamed as more guards approached her, the sound shrill and desperate. He's unnatural. You've all seen what he is. No woman can endure him. Ivy's response cut through the chaos, her voice calm and clear. The only unnatural thing here is your cruelty disguised as concern. The hall erupted, not in gasps this time, but in applause that started with the common citizens at the back and rolled forward like a wave until even some nobles were on their feet. As guards dragged the conspirators toward the dungeons, their protests echoing off vaulted ceilings, Asher took Ivy's hand. The entire hall could see the way he cradled it with impossible gentleness despite the fury still radiating from his frame, the contrast between his power and his tenderness visible to everyone. My people, he announced, his voice carrying to every corner. Meet your future queen, the woman who crossed the Crimson Gorge to save my life, who saw a king when everyone else saw a curse. The applause became a roar. The musicians began playing again, a triumphant melody that spoke of victory and justice. What had begun as orchestrated performance transformed into genuine celebration. For the first time in 4 years of rejections and isolation, Asher allowed himself to hope. Not tentative, fragile hope that might shatter, but solid, real hope built on the foundation of someone who'd chosen him completely. Justice had come home to the palace, and with it, the promise that different didn't mean wrong, and that love was worth bleeding for. Peace settled over the kingdom like morning mist after a storm, soft, transformative, carrying the promise of clearer days ahead. The trials had ended swiftly once the evidence was presented. Darius and Seraphina faced justice publicly, their conspiracy laid bare before the entire court. 3 days after the coronation gala, Asher took Ivy's hand and led her through the forest paths she'd once run bleeding and desperate. But this time, the journey was different, unhurried, safe, his massive frame beside her rather than unknown in the darkness. The waterfall sanctuary appeared through the trees like a memory becoming real. Cascading water caught the afternoon sunlight, turning each droplet into liquid diamonds. The crystalline pool reflected the sky, peaceful and perfect. "This was always my hiding place," Asher said quietly, his dark eyes on the falls. "Somewhere I could exist without judgment." Ivy squeezed his hand. "And now?" He pulled her into the shallows, the water cool against their bare feet, soaking the hem of her dress. "Now it feels like freedom instead of exile." They stood there as the waterfall crashed around them, the sound a constant lullaby that had witnessed both their first meeting and countless moments of Asher's isolation before that. "I have something to ask you properly," he said, his voice carrying that mixture of strength and vulnerability that still made her heart stutter. Ivy looped her arms around his neck, smiling up at him. "Haven't you already asked me twice?" "Third time's tradition," he murmured, and then, to her surprise, he knelt in the water, looking up at her with those dark, vulnerable eyes that held both pain and hope in equal measure. The sight of him kneeling before her in the place where they'd first met, water flowing around them both, stole every word from her lips. 19 times, I tried to give my mother's ring away," he began, his deep voice steady despite the emotion threading through each word. Desperate for anyone to accept it. Desperate to be normal, acceptable, worthy. He took her hand gently, his thumb brushing over the moonstone that had stayed on her finger through the crimson gorge, through conspiracy and danger and triumph. "But it was always meant for you. The one who ran toward me instead of away. Who chose me not despite my differences, but including them." His voice steadied, formal and beautiful. "Ivy Moreau, will you marry me here, in the place where you taught me that sanctuary isn't about hiding, it's about being safe enough to be seen?" Ivy pulled him up with both hands, water splashing around them, and kissed him as the waterfall crashed in its endless song. "Yes," she said against his lips. "Always completely yes." His laugh was pure joy, rumbling through his chest as he lifted her off her feet and spun her in the pool, water cascading over them both, washing away years of rejection and loneliness. The weeks that followed brought joyful chaos that transformed the entire palace. Wedding preparations tangled with legislative sessions as Asher and his council drafted comprehensive Omega protection laws. Marcus Fletcher coordinated with city officials to establish rescue networks for trafficking survivors, safe houses in every province. Ivy insisted on a ceremony at the waterfall, open to everyone, nobles and commoners alike. "No hidden courtyards or private chambers," she declared during a planning meeting with the increasingly frazzled wedding coordinator. "We have nothing to hide." The coordinator looked faint. "But Your Majesty-to-be, the logistics of accommodating thousands." "Then we accommodate thousands," Ivy said firmly. "This wedding celebrates more than just us. It celebrates everyone who's been told they're too different to deserve love." Asher watched her command the room with quiet pride, this woman who'd once been marked as defective merchandise now reshaping a kingdom. The night before the wedding, tradition demanded they sleep separately. Ivy lay in the guest chambers, staring at the ceiling, her body buzzing with anticipation that made sleep impossible. A soft knock came at midnight. A servant stood there bearing a sealed letter, the royal crest pressed into crimson wax. Ivy broke the seal with trembling fingers. "I've forgotten how to sleep without you nearby. You've ruined my solitude completely. I'm grateful for the ruin. Tomorrow can't come fast enough." She laughed, the sound echoing in the quiet chamber, and immediately requested parchment and ink. Her response took shape quickly.
"Good.
Tomorrow I'll ruin your peace, your privacy, and your lonely waterfall sanctuary too. Hope you're prepared for a lifetime of disruption. See you at the altar." In his own chambers across the palace, Asher read her reply and felt something he'd thought impossible just months ago, uncomplicated, giddy happiness that had nothing to do with conquest or duty, and everything to do with being chosen. He pressed the note to his chest and didn't care how lovesick it made him look. Tomorrow, he would marry the woman who taught him that being different wasn't the same as being wrong. That love wasn't about finding someone who fit perfectly. It was about finding someone who chose you, scars and all, again and again. Outside their separate windows, the kingdom prepared for a royal wedding unlike any in history. Not because of pageantry or guest lists, but because it would celebrate something revolutionary. Two people society had deemed unworthy, proving that the only opinion that mattered was each other's. Dawn broke over the sacred waterfall, painting the cascading water in shades of rose and gold. The entire kingdom seemed to have gathered, thousands of people lining the forest paths, filling the clearings, standing shoulder to shoulder without regard for rank or station. Nobles stood beside commoners, former slaves beside the nobles who'd helped liberate them, all witnessing something unprecedented. Asher stood in the shallows, water flowing around his calves, wearing formal ceremonial attire but barefoot, vulnerable in a way no king had ever allowed himself to be. His dark hair was unbound, falling in waves to his shoulders, and his hands trembled slightly as he waited. When Ivy appeared at the forest's edge, every breath in the crowd caught simultaneously. She wore a flowing white gown that trailed in the water as she walked, also barefoot, her auburn hair adorned with jasmine blossoms. The morning light turned her hair to copper fire, and her emerald eyes held only him. They met in the center of the pool, exactly where she'd crashed into his life months ago, desperate and bleeding. The water swirled around them, the waterfall's song the only sound as thousands watched in reverent silence. The high priestess spoke of ancient bonds and sacred unions, her voice carrying across the water. But when it came time for vows, Asher's words were entirely his own. "I vow to see you clearly," he began, his deep voice steady despite the emotion in his dark eyes. "Not as property, not as lesser, but as my equal in all things." He took both her hands, cradling them with that devastating gentleness that still made her breath catch. "I vow to hold you gently, not because you're fragile, but because gentleness is how strength becomes love." His voice grew fiercer. "And I vow to love you fiercely, protecting not just your body but your right to be exactly who you are. To choose you every day, in every way, for the rest of my life." Ivy's response made him tremble, tears streaming down her face as she spoke. "I vow to see all of you, every part you were told to hide, every difference they called wrong." Her voice rang clear across the water. "I vow to stay when it's hard, to fight when it matters, and to choose you every single day." She reached up to cup his scarred jaw. "You taught me that being seen completely is the greatest gift we can give each other." Their kiss, surrounded by falling water and witnessed by thousands, felt like a promise the entire kingdom made together. The crowd erupted in celebration, cheers and applause echoing through the forest, music beginning to play, joy transforming the sacred space into something alive and electric. 6 months later, the waterfall looked the same, but everything had changed. Ivy stood waist-deep in the crystalline pool, visibly pregnant, the water supporting her weight as it had that first desperate night. Asher's massive hands spanned her belly, his touch reverent and gentle. "Can you feel them moving?" Ivy asked, covering his hands with hers. He nodded, his voice thick with emotion he no longer tried to hide. Like butterfly wings. Around them, the kingdom had transformed in ways both visible and invisible. The Omega protection laws had passed the council unanimously, comprehensive legislation that outlawed trafficking, established rehabilitation centers, and ensured legal personhood for all. Safe houses operated in every province, staffed by former slaves who understood survival. Trafficking rings had been dismantled one by one, their operators facing the same justice Darius and Seraphina had met. In the palace courtyards, young alphas trained under Asher's direct instruction, learning that discipline mattered more than dominance, that restraint was the truest form of strength. Former slaves worked alongside nobles in positions of genuine authority, redefining what power meant in this new kingdom. "What will we tell them?" Ivy asked softly, meaning their child who would grow up in this transformed world. Asher's answer came without hesitation, his lips pressed to her temple as the waterfall crashed its eternal song around them. "That being different isn't wrong, it's just being yourself." That love isn't about finding someone who fits society's expectations, but about choosing someone whose differences make you both stronger. He turned her gently in his arms, his dark eyes holding hers with that intensity that still made her heart race. And that the bravest thing you can do is let yourself be completely seen. Ivy smiled, her hands framing his face. They'll be lucky to have you as a father. They'll be lucky to have you as a mother, he countered. You're the one who taught me all of this. The afternoon sun filtered through the cascading water, turning everything golden. This sanctuary that had once been Asher's hiding place from judgment was now truly a home, a place where two people who'd been told they were too broken or too much had learned they were exactly enough. Below them, the kingdom they were reshaping spread out in a patchwork of fields and forests, cities and villages where the old rules were giving way to something better. Where difference was becoming celebrated rather than condemned. Where love was defined not by fitting perfectly together, but by choosing each other fiercely despite every obstacle. The final image painted itself in the golden light. Asher and Ivy in the sacred pool, hands intertwined over the life growing between them, the waterfall singing its endless song. Proof that the greatest power isn't in being normal, but in being brave enough to be exactly who you are. And that sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply being seen completely and choosing to stay.